Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. When we think about World War II, we think about battles, guns, heroics, injury, and death. We may even have read some of the letters soldiers received from their loved ones that helped sustain them during the war years. But few of us know about a war effort that was in turn simple and incredibly complex, and which brought another powerful weapon to the war: books. Lawyer and historian Molly Guptill Manning tells how American volunteers, book publishers, printers, the armed services, and the government united to bring millions of books to servicemen in every part of the world, no matter how treacherous the journey. In When Books Went to War, the stories that helped us win World War II, recently published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, she describes how books changed those soldiers and our country permanently. Welcome.
Thank you.
Now, you are an attorney and also a writer. What motivated you to write this book?
Well, when I was researching my first book, The Myth of Ephraim Tutt, I was at Princeton University going through the archives of Charles Scribner's Sons, which was a huge publishing house in the 1940s. And as I was going through those records, I kept coming across letters from American servicemen thanking Charles Scribner's Sons for providing miniature books called Armed Services Editions. And the letters were so enthusiastic, and I had never heard of Armed Services Editions, that I decided to look into what they were even talking about. And that's how I discovered this topic, and I've just loved researching it and finding out as much as I can.
It was originally called the Victory Book Campaign, and it was initiated by librarians in the American Library Association. What was the rationale behind wanting to send books to soldiers?
Well, it started out initially where librarians were watching what was happening in Nazi Germany in the 1930s, where books were being burned. Lists were made of books that were not allowed in Germany. And then these ideas and concepts spread across Europe as Germany invaded France and Poland and Russia.
And so there were book burnings in many countries.
Yes. In fact, entire libraries would be set on fire and burned. And so over the course of the war, over 100 million books were destroyed by the German army. And so as librarians were watching this happening from the United States, they felt like they did not want to have to purge their bookshelves, and they did not want to see book burnings happening in the United States. And so they decided that they needed to come up with some kind of defense in this war of words, which is how they described it. And so they decided that the best way to fight against the destruction of ideas and the destruction of books was to encourage Americans to read as many books as they could, to spread as many ideas as they could. But once America actually went to war, the impetus kind of shifted because there was a serious morale problem in Army training camps because there wasn't entertainment for the men during their free time. And so the Army felt that effective soldiers would have to be happy. They couldn't just be learning how to fight. They needed to actually feel good about what they were doing. And part of that was keeping them entertained sometimes. And so books ended up being what they turned to because it was difficult to build movie theaters and providing sporting equipment and sporting rings and things like that, but books were relatively cheap, they're portable, and they'd provide hours of entertainment. And so librarians ended up creating the Victory Book Campaign to help stock Army libraries with books.
So how did they get Americans, this big book donation campaign, how did they get Americans to donate books? It was really a big book drive, right?
It was the biggest book drive in history. Every library in the United States took part in this. And so librarians were asked to maybe come out of their comfort zone a little bit and become publicists, become advertisers. And so they reached out to their local newspaper, their radio stations. They had posters that they asked stores in their town to post to remind people to donate books. They really went the extra mile to try to publicize the fact that there was this huge campaign going on and why soldiers needed books. And they were remarkably successful. In 1942, they collected over 10 million books for the Army training camps.
This book drive reaches its goal, which was collecting 10 million books, and then donations from the public started to slow, and the Army and the Navy took over the funding of the book program, creating something called the Council on Books in Wartime. Who was on the council?
The council was composed of almost every major publishing company in the United States, so over 70 publishers, including even a few university presses. And what they wanted to do was, with Victory Book Campaign, they had no control over what books were donated. And so some people donated books that were completely unsuitable for young men. And so like books on how to knit, or poetry books from the 1800s and things like that might not be the most entertaining for men who were predominantly in their 20s. And so by having publishers get involved, they could hand select books that would be especially liked by young men. And so this program of Armed Services Editions developed, where publishers with the Army and Navy came together and they picked titles every month and sent between 30 and 40 books to each unit to read.
Now, there were some challenges in creating a book that would be suitable to send to men in the services. What were some of those challenges?
Well, one of the first things was for men on the move, for men who were going to be frontline foot soldiers, they carried everything on their backs. And so carrying a hardcover book became completely impractical because they were heavy, they're large, and they had more important gear that they probably needed to bring with them within the small spaces that they had in their packs. And so if publishers wanted to create a book that they could actually, foot soldiers could actually carry with them, they needed to be small, they needed to be paperbacks, and they needed to be exceptionally lightweight. And so what they decided to do was create a book so small that they could fit in the pockets of a standard issue military uniform. And so these books are probably about the size of a smartphone today. And they had to create books that could be read no matter how difficult the lighting might be, or what could be, you know, it's not going to be like they have a lamp over their head and they're just quietly reading if they're in a foxhole somewhere. And so the publishers realized that by publishing books with 2 columns of text on every page, it would be easier for people to read, because rather than having to get across 4 or 5 inches of text, you could just get across 1.5 to 2 inches, and it was just less stressful on the eyes.
So they were wider than they were tall,
Right.
And they were stapled instead of being glued, because they figured some places the glue, insects would eat the glue, or the glue would come undone.
Exactly.
Okay, so how did they choose what kinds of books to print up?
There's basically a 3-part process. First, publishers would look at the lists of books that they were printing, and they would just hand select any titles that seemed great. So bestsellers were automatically included. Sports books, westerns, anything that seemed like it would be appealing to young men were selected. And then they had a group of people who were hired as readers to read through the books, and anything that hadn't a potentially offensive viewpoint or professed a discriminatory attitude, these books were highlighted, because the idea was not to demoralize people. The idea was to entertain them. And so by having things in books that might be offensive or make people angry was not the point. And then the third step was the Army and Navy would see the final list of titles, and then they could add or subtract any that they wanted. And then later on, there was kind of a fourth way that they would pick titles, which was getting feedback from the servicemen themselves.
Mm-hmm.
The publishers put an ad in the popular newspaper Stars and Stripes asking for servicemen feedback. So whatever titles they wanted to read, if there were titles that they hated, if they wanted, you know, fewer classic and more sports stories, they could write in and just say what they wanted.
Okay. Now, I would think that for an author, having your book chosen as an Armed Services edition was an honor.
It was. One author said that she felt more proud of the fact that her book was made into an Armed Services edition than when it was made Book of the Month Club. And so to be chosen was a huge honor. And then they were also frequently rewarded by receiving letters from servicemen who read their books and saying what the books meant to them.
Now, this program gave a big boost to the whole paperback book industry, because paperbacks were not as big then as they are now.
That's right. In 1939, for instance, only 200,000 paperbacks were printed. Over the course of this book program, after the war, in 1947, 95 million paperbacks were printed. So you can see there was this huge shift in the American publishing industry where paperbacks went from something that nobody wanted to print, mainly because there wasn't much of a profit margin to be made, to something that everyone printed after the war.
Okay, so the first shipment was 1.5 million books in September 1943. How did the servicemen respond to the books?
They were so delighted to receive them. On the one hand, I think a lot of people were surprised to receive books. And then once they realized why they were receiving books and that American publishers cared about their morale, as did the Army and Navy, they were really touched that this was going on, because it was one of the few morale programs that was so successful. And it was something that these books served as a reminder of home, especially when mail wasn't coming through. Sometimes it would take 4 or 5 months for letters from their families to arrive. And so at a time when they were homesick and feeling isolated, stationed in foreign countries all over the world, to receive a book from America, usually about American life, was a huge boon.
Did the books go virtually everywhere soldiers were stationed?
They were. There's stories of books being sent to units that were all over the world, sometimes by parachute. Sometimes they were just delivered with weapons and other materials that had to come through. The books remarkably made it just about everywhere, even on remote Pacific islands.
Mm-hmm. So how many books, how many Armed Services Edition books were produced and shipped over time?
Over the course of the war, from 1943 to 1947, 123 million Armed Services editions were printed.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
That's incredible. And according to your book, they read them virtually everywhere.
That's right.
In foxholes, in the hospitals, and in the midst of battle.
That's
you know,
right.
when they were pinned down by fire, gunfire, they take out a book, whip out a book, and read it.
Well, it's one of the only stress relievers that they had. And so if they were stuck in a foxhole under heavy fire and they needed to wait for reinforcements because it was a hopeless situation, rather than sit there and think about how they could die at any second, or just waiting for the seconds to tick by until the replacements arrived, they could just open a book and focus on something that would just allow them to escape from the stressful situation that they were in. And so they did read under fire sometimes. But also, war can be incredibly boring. I mean, most history books talk about the battles, which are the most exciting part. But a lot of the time they were waiting. Once a battle was over, they would have to wait for their next mission. Sometimes they were just waiting for the mail to come to see if they received a letter from a loved one. Sometimes, you know, they were just waiting to go home or waiting to ship out. And so during these times of waiting, they needed something to do, because otherwise they could just focus on the possibility of, you know, dying in the next battle or having other negative thoughts. And so these books served as a really important distraction, in addition to being an entertainment.
We're going to take a short break, then I'll be back with more with Molly Guptill Manning after this message. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Molly Guptill Manning, author of When Books Went to War, the stories that helped us win World War II. It's just been published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and it's received wonderful reviews. Now, some of the most popular books among the soldiers were books by women authors. The top book was Betty Smith's A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. Other favorites were Catherine Ann Porter's short stories and Rosemary Taylor's Chicken Every Sunday. What was it about these books in particular?
I think that with Betty Smith and Rosemary Taylor especially, their books were about life at home. And they were very, they just produced nostalgia in the men. It made them think of their own childhoods and their own families and their own upbringings. And at a time when they were so removed from these things, I think that it just was such a welcome escape, to go back to their childhoods in their own minds, and to be thinking about less stressful times.
And there were two other books that were widely requested by soldiers for other reasons. The novels Strange Fruit and Forever Amber, both of which had been banned in Boston. What was it about those books?
These books had sex scenes, and so as one man wrote to the Council on Books in Wartime, what the men wanted was books with sex scenes, and a lot of them. And so these books were, they're probably, by today's standards, they were tame, but back then they caused a bit of a ruckus in Boston, and Boston banned both of them as being indecent. But Strange Fruit actually was a very moving book about an interracial couple who ended up having an affair. The woman became pregnant, and then they had to deal with living in a world where they weren't allowed to marry. And it really exposed a lot of delicate social issues that were really intertwined with what men were fighting for during World War II, which was against Hitler's racial policies and things like that. And so it wasn't like the books were just pure smut. I mean, they were important books. And in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt came out and spoke in favor of Strange Fruit, saying that it was a book that everybody should read.
Now, there were some efforts to ban them from the American Service editions, right? But the Council on Books in Wartime fought against that and kept the books on the list.
Yes. The American publishers were very resistant to the idea of censoring soldiers' reading material because, again, back to like the Victory Book Campaign ideas, this was a war being fought against the banning of books and against the burning of books. And so for the American Army and Navy to have restrictions on the type of books that could be read by American soldiers seemed really antithetical to what they were fighting for. And so the publishers had a meeting where they had to talk about whether Forever Amber and Strange Fruit should be published, and they decided that if the books that the men wanted to read had sex scenes, then they were going to get books that had sex scenes.
Okay. Tell me about the overseas editions.
The overseas editions were printed in cooperation with the Office of War Information. So these are more propaganda-ish, where throughout Europe, as books were being destroyed, printing presses fell under German control, and nations that were conquered by Germany lacked a free press. They lacked the freedom to read whatever they wanted. And so as the Allied forces made strides across Europe and
liberated a number of countries.
Right, they also liberated them with books. And so these overseas editions were small paperbacks that were distributed in countries that were liberated, so that they could start reading the books that they had been prohibited from reading during the war.
Did they continue to ship books, American Service editions, after the armistice when U.S. soldiers were still in the process of being, they were still overseas, but they're in the process of being, I guess, demobilized?
Yes. The books were printed until June 1947, and the war, of course, ended in August 1945. And so for almost 2 years, they continued to be printed because there were about 2 million occupation troops across Europe and the Pacific, and there wasn't a way to give them other entertainments because there weren't enough soldiers to continue with, movies and things like that. And so the need for books was just as great as it was during the war.
So the Armed Services Edition program came to a halt in 1947?
Yes.
Okay. You write that exposure to these books had a lifetime impact on many servicemen.
That's right. It was said that before they joined the Army, the average person was in the 11th grade and they did not read books. And so when they were given books during their military service, and sometimes out of pure desperation for something to do, men started reading. But in doing so, they started to prove to themselves that they actually enjoyed reading. And so many people developed a habit of reading books during their military service. And so when they returned home, they continued the habit. They wanted to continue to read. And another thing that happened is that I think that they proved to themselves during their military service that they enjoyed doing something as scholarly as reading. And so when they were offered an opportunity to earn a free college education under the GI Bill, many men decided to go for it. And it turns out that they ended up being some of the best students that were in schools in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
So it really, supplying these books during the war really led to a more educated populace in the United States. And it also changed Americans' attitudes towards books. First of all, now you have, the paperback book industry is now booming. And, even people who had not been, fought in the war, started reading or had access to cheaper books.
Right. Before there was a real paperback industry in the United States, most books cost between $2.50 and $3, which doesn't sound like a lot today, but that was a luxury item back then. And so, practically speaking, most people who could afford to buy books were the wealthy. With the advent of paperback books, which were sold for only 25 cents, almost anybody could afford those. And so there's almost this democratization of books that the war brought about, so that after the war, just about anyone could afford to buy paperback books. And in fact, during the housing boom of the 1950s, for the first time, bookshelves in American living rooms became a standard option.
Okay. Does the military still provide books for troops serving in wherever?
Right. There are libraries. What I think is kind of interesting is the Navy has started distributing an e-reader device that is preloaded with hundreds of books. And so if people are stationed on a submarine, for instance, where there's probably no internet signal and they can't exactly have a library probably on the submarine, they can have hundreds of books at their fingertips thanks to these e-readers that are being distributed. It's a pilot program, I believe, right now, but they're thinking about making it larger, and it would be interesting to see if the Army follows suit.
Okay. What did you learn in the course of your research that surprised you?
Really, I was surprised by how much something as small as a little paperback could mean to a person. I mean, I love reading books, and there are books that I've read and have felt so sorry to put down because I love the characters so much. But the idea that being away at war, which seems, it didn't seem like there might be that many opportunities to read. And I was surprised by how many opportunities there were to read and how many people gravitated towards reading books, basically as a way to survive the war emotionally and psychologically.
And you give some, some anecdotes about, some of the servicemen who talk about how having these books affected them. I think you talked about, one soldier who was lying in bed reading and what that did for him. Tell about some of that.
I opened my book with a letter from a Marine who wrote to Betty Smith, just asking her in the very beginning of the letter, have you ever felt so upset that you just had to tell someone about it? And then he confided that that's how he was feeling then. And he went on to tell her how he had been fighting for 2 years, and from the day he watched his friend die right in front of him and he was helpless to save his friend, he felt like his heart had died. And he said that he didn't think he'd ever be capable of feeling an emotion again. And so for 2 years he kind of just went through the motions with his dead heart. And it wasn't until he was hospitalized with malaria and he asked a nurse for a book to read, and he was given a Tree Grows in Brooklyn, that things began to change for him. There's something about that book that awakened his heart. He started to laugh. There were parts that made him cry. And he said that even though he was a battle-hardened Marine, he was proud of those tears because it proved that he was human again. And so that books would have such an incredible transformative aspect to them, I think is one of the most beautiful parts of this book and this whole story.
You also write that the Armed Services Edition program was one of the best run and most successful programs in the entire war.
There were a lot of other programs that were designed to help give relief to the soldiers and the service and the sailors, but when it came down to it, the publishers, the librarians in the Army and the Navy, they were so dedicated to this program that they would not allow anything to get in their way of getting these books to the servicemen and sailors month after month on time. And so just through their uncompromising standards and devotion, it really was the best run program. There weren't delays and people got the books that they wanted.
What was the research, the process of researching this book like? We've only got a minute left, but I'm interested in.
I combed through a lot of archives because things are housed all over the place. Like the American Library Association is in Illinois, or their records are in Illinois. The Council on Books in Wartime is in Princeton. The New York Public Library houses the Victory Book Campaigns. And then different authors have their papers distributed all over the United States. But I love that kind of research, and so it was really a labor of love going through them all and finding the letters from the servicemen and learning about these programs.
It really is a fascinating, untold story because, like, who knew?
Yeah, it's really incredible.
Well, now we do, and thank you for ferreting out the story for us and telling it so well, because it really is a fascinating story. We're out of time. I want to thank Molly Guptill Manning for joining me. When Books Went to War, the stories that helped us win World War II is being published by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. For the City University of New York and 1 to 1, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.